Somewhere beneath the waves, so the story goes, lies a lost world. A civilization greater than any before it, swallowed by the sea in a single day and a single night. We know the name, Atlantis. For centuries, it has been called a myth, a parable, a metaphor for hubris, and yet, something about Plato's description of Atlantis feels strange, because buried in his words, written nearly 2,400 years ago, are details that sound suspiciously like us. What if Atlantis isn't just a myth about the past? What if it's a warning, or even a glimpse into our future? The story of Atlantis comes to us from just two works, Plato's Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. In them, Plato describes a vast island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis was rich, technologically advanced, and organized into concentric rings of land and sea, with a gleaming central citadel. It was a naval superpower, waging war across the Mediterranean, until Athens itself resisted their might. And then came catastrophe. Atlantis sank beneath the waves, destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single night. Most people today hear Atlantis and think of fantasy, but to Plato, it was no bedtime story. He presents it as sobering history. Crucially, Plato doesn't claim the story as his own invention. He says it came from Egyptian priests, passed to Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, who then passed it down his family line until it reached Plato himself. If that's true, then Atlantis may not have been a Greek story after all, but an Egyptian one. Remember, by Plato's day, Egyptian civilization was already thousands of years old. Their priests spoke of cycles of flood, of forgotten ages, of entire peoples washed away by time. To them, the story of a mighty land swallowed by the sea may not have been a myth at all, but just memory. So, what really was Atlantis? If Atlantis was based on reality, the most convincing inspiration is the Minoan civilization. The Minoans, centered on Crete, were Europe's first great maritime power. They built sprawling palaces, developed trade networks across the Mediterranean, and engineered technologies that feel startlingly modern, such as running water, drainage systems, even something resembling air conditioning. And then came the eruption of Thera, which is modern-day Santorini, around 1600 BC. One of the largest volcanic explosions in history ripped the island apart, sending tidal waves crashing into Crete. Within a generation, the Minoan Empire completely collapsed. To later Greeks, this catastrophe could easily have transformed into myth, a mighty seafaring civilization wiped out in a single cataclysm. So, perhaps Plato wasn't inventing Atlantis out of thin air. He was simply remembering, in distorted form, the Minoans. The ruins themselves are haunting. At Akrotiri on Santorini, archaeologists have uncovered a city frozen in ash. Multi-story houses, vibrant wall paintings, advanced plumbing systems, even flushing toilets. Yes, actual flushing toilets. To ancient Greeks, stumbling upon such ruins must have felt like glimpsing an alien world. When Plato described glittering palaces, vast fleets, and strange technologies, perhaps he wasn't imagining the impossible. Perhaps he was echoing memories of real civilizations, advanced, creative, powerful, that disappeared almost overnight. Atlantis then might not be a single lost city at all, but a patchwork memory of many lost worlds. And yet, some of Plato's descriptions sound less like the Bronze Age and more like our own. He speaks of power coursing across the land, of a central hub radiating energy, of networks collecting people across great distances. These lines have long struck readers as peculiar and uncanny. Could Plato's vision of Atlantis mirror something like electricity, maybe telephones, communication systems, even the skeleton of a modern technological world? Of course, Plato wasn't predicting smartphones or power grids, but it's unsettling to read words from 2,000 years ago that map so closely onto our present-day civilization, almost as if Atlantis wasn't just a story of the past, but a warning for the future. Descriptions of worlds being connected, of grids communicating with each other, these are almost too coincidental to some people to seem like mere coincidence, and yet they were described. This is one of the most fascinating and perplexing aspects of the Atlantis myth. But of course, this is where Plato's genius really shines through. Because whether Atlantis was real or not, his point was never about archaeology. It was about human hubris. Atlantis, he says, fell because it grew arrogant, because wealth, power, and ambition corrupted it, because it sought domination rather than balance. Now, does that sound familiar? Perhaps the true power of the Atlantis myth is that every age sees itself reflected within it. The Athenians of Plato's time, the explorers of the Renaissance, and now us, living in glittering cities connected by vast networks wielding technology beyond our imagination, all while standing on the edge of environmental and social catastrophe. But here's something we don't often stop and think about: our trust in Plato himself. Consider Socrates. Almost everything we know about Socrates comes from Plato's dialogues. We hear his voice, we watch him question the Athenians, we follow him all the way to his death sentence, yet nearly all of it is filtered through Plato's pen. Plato was not a journalist. He was a philosopher. Sometimes he was a biologist, but not as much as Aristotle. But the point is that he was dramatizing conversations, building arguments, and often using Socrates as a character to explore his own ideas. And yet, historians are quite confident that Socrates existed. Well, why? Because Plato is maybe not our only witness. Socrates also appears in Xenophon's writings. He's mocked by Aristophanes in the Clouds. Aristotle, writing a generation later, refers to him as a real figure. In short, Socrates passes the quote-unquote historian's test. Multiple independent sources, even if the details do differ. But the point remains that the bulk of our understanding of Socrates and the account of Socrates does just arrive from Plato. Now, compare this with Atlantis. Atlantis appears primarily only in Plato's works, specifically the Timaeus and Critias. No historian of his time really mentions it, no poet sings of it. No Egyptian record has yet been found to confirm the story Plato claims to have inherited from the priests. When later authors do discuss Atlantis, they do so only by citing Plato, not because they had knowledge of it themselves. So here's the paradox. We treat Socrates as historical fact, even though much of his life may be Plato's invention. And yet we dismiss Atlantis as pure fiction, even though Plato presented it in the same way as he did Socrates, as a real account passed down from earlier times. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why do we trust Plato when he writes about people, but not when he writes about places? Is it because the existence of a man is easier to accept than the destruction of an entire civilization? Or because Atlantis fits too neatly into the pattern of myth, while Socrates fits neatly into the pattern of history. Perhaps Atlantis suffers from what we might call the single source problem. A lone voice, even one as great as Plato's, is not enough to establish fact. And yet, when that lone voice belongs to Plato, the philosopher who gave us Socrates, who laid the foundations of Western thought, should we be so quick to dismiss him? Okay, maybe Plato was embellishing, reshaping an older tradition for his philosophical goals, but maybe, just maybe, in dismissing Atlantis, we are ignoring history's most tantalizing clue. So, was Atlantis real? Maybe. It could have been the Minoans, it could have been Egyptian memory. It could have been a composite of countless forgotten civilizations swallowed by time. Or it could have been nothing more than a story. But in the end, the power of Atlantis is not in whether it existed, but in why it endures. Atlantis is us. Our triumphs, our technology, our arrogance, and perhaps our fate. Thank you all for watching. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the video. This is a bit of a shorter form video, just something that's a bit speculative on a topic that I'm particularly interested in, obviously, in Atlantis. So if you enjoyed this type of short form video, then do give it a like, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye bye.